Second, I hope that we're all using Zoom tonight, so I know the internet traffic can be crazy. So hopefully we won't have freeze frames as we go through this. Fingers crossed. Third, we will be recording tonight's session. We're going to make this available to all of our classmates who weren't able to attend tonight. Many of you who were on last month's program heard me say this, but the objective of the 78 Connect program, we do run these monthly or bi-monthly. We try to have a range of topics and speakers that can address diverse interests of our class and the experiences that our classmates have gone through. The goal is to really reconnect members of the class of 78 in a fun, informative, intimate, and interactive way, even if it's not in person, but using Zoom. I did recently hear that the link to tonight's session was sent out to some non-78ers, so that's totally cool. But I think in the future, we'll try to keep this all to 78 only, just again, to try to meet the above objectives. As noted, we'll be recording the session and make it all available for all the alumni too in the college. Tonight's session with Tim is focused on perspectives on professional and collegiate sports programs during and after this crazy pandemic. The format that we'll use, similar to last week, I received a number of questions from classmates, which I'll ask Tim a number of those questions. We'll spend probably the next 20 or 30 minutes doing a Q&A. Then we'll open up the lines, because I think you're all muted right now, but we'll then open up the lines and I'll be able to unmute folks. We'll give you the instructions how you can ask questions of Tim at that time. We targeted about an hour from start to end, but Tim is willing to stay on to answer any and all questions. Now, many of you may remember Tim, from days in Williamstown at the Log, but basically Tim's profile, currently he is a writer at large at NBC Sports and NBCSports.com. Prior to that, he spent 25 years as a senior writer at Sports Illustrated and SI.com. He is nationally recognized, an award-winning feature writer, and a digital columnist. He's covered a range of the most prestigious sporting events in the world, coaches, and athletes all over the world, the United States. On a personal side, Todd Eggerson, who knew that Tim was speaking tonight, shared a great story with me. As many of you know, Todd is obviously a classmate, but was also one of our panelists in last month's program, Teaching in Prison. Todd shared with me that he was totally amazed when he invited Tim to participate in the McDougall Walker prison system, which was a level 4 or 5 prison facility. He said that when Tim spoke to that group in such a personalized and intimate manner, he said it made such a personal impact on the lives of those inmates. That just shows you the true character of Tim Layden. So we're honored to have Tim, Class 78, joining us tonight. So Tim, welcome aboard.
Hey, thanks, John. Glad to be here. I just want to make it clear I was never in the Log.
Yes, sure.
At least I don't remember being there.
I am sure we're going to find a photo to prove that. Okay, my friend? So
yeah, I'm
anyway,
afraid of that.
Yeah. So Tim, again, thanks for joining us tonight. So
yeah,
Tim,
great.
Tell me how you and your family are holding up in the crazy pandemic.
Oh, we're good. We're empty nesters. My wife, Janet, and I, we live in Northern Connecticut. Really, compared to what a lot of people have been through, we're super lucky. We live in an area that's, I've told a lot of people we live in a place that's really boring. There's a lot of space, and it's a place for young kids and families. And as empty nesters, it's pretty quiet, but that's been a real benefit in this period. A lot of room to ride a bike and go for a walk and stay out of trouble. And just my heart goes out to people that have lived through this and are still living through it in urban centers where you just have to be careful going outside your house. And both of my kids are in that situation, so we understand it. And but we're fine. And we haven't had anybody really close to us get really sick or die. So knocking on wood. But we're good.
Oh, that's great. I'm really glad you and the family are well. And I noticed that I think your children are also getting involved with the sports writing and very involved in the industries too.
Actually, my daughter's a television writer and couldn't care less about sports. And my son he's an engineer with a big software company. But very much interested in sports and always has been. So we got one sports and one non-sports, which is, I think, a healthy distribution.
That's awesome, man. So take us briefly through your journey, from your days in Williamstown, not at the Log, to your early career jobs that eventually led you to Sports Illustrated.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, people may or may not remember on there. I did start writing sports when I was at Williams, for the record. I always like to tell the story that the first story I ever wrote with my name on it was in winter study of our freshman year, 78 freshman year. And I was assigned to cover a wrestling match between Williams and Dartmouth. And it was supposed to be 3 or 4 paragraphs. It was assigned by Dan Daly, class of 76, who went on to do a great career as a sports journalist himself. And that first story was a wrestling match in LaSalle, like I said, between Williams and Dartmouth. And the match was surprisingly close. It went right down to the last match, which was the heavyweight match. And the 2 participants in that heavyweight match were Dartmouth's star middle linebacker who wrestled in the winter, named Reggie Williams, who also went on to play 13 years in the NFL, was about 6 feet tall and 245 pounds, and a very strong man and intimidating man. And he was wrestling my roommate, Charlie Davis. And Charlie was a wonderful guy, a brilliant guy, had a long career in medicine in the Navy. And but at the time, he was kind of a tall, skinny, 210-pounder. And in the deciding match of the first sports writing event I ever covered, Reggie Williams walked out to the middle of the mat and picked up Charlie and slammed him down onto his back and jumped on top of him and pinned him in a few seconds, and that ended the match. So I had the privilege of putting my byline on a story in which my roommate and close friend was the GOAT. And I don't mean G-O-A-T, I mean GOAT. So it was an interesting introduction to sports writing, where I wound up in a controversial story before I even knew how to type or put my byline on a story. The rest of it isn't that long. I went from Williams to a paper in Schenectady, New York, the Schenectady Gazette. I had 2 career options. One was to become an assistant basketball coach at Springfield College, and the other was to go into journalism in Schenectady, and I picked journalism for no reason that I can remember. In Schenectady, I spent the better part of 8 years covering Little League and bowling and high school cross country and football and high school basketball. And it wasn't glamorous, and I almost left it 25 times because it wasn't glamorous, but it taught me skills for interpersonal relationships and interviewing and just making connections that I use all the way to today. My next job was in Albany, and it was such a lateral move that I didn't have to move. I could stay in the same house, but it was a paper with much bigger aspirations, and the sports editor there put me on the beat covering Mike Tyson, gave me a column, sent me to big sporting events, had me covering the Albany Patroons basketball team, who were coached by Phil Jackson. And from there, I went to Newsday after 3 years, and again, a guy named Dick Sandler was the sports editor there. And we all need breaks, and Al Vieira gave me a break in Albany, and Dick Sandler gave me a break at Newsday. And I spent 6 years at Newsday covering mostly major college football and basketball, but also a lot of the Knicks and Giants. Covered a lot of those Knicks Bulls series that we all saw in The Last Dance. And those were great memories. And from there in 1994, I went to Sports Illustrated and spent 25 years there. Came in as the college football writer, but have covered just about every sport since then. I've been able to stay a generalist in a business that's become much more focused on specialization. So I'm another lucky break there. And 2 years ago, I started doing, actually 3 years ago now, I started doing freelance work or contract work for NBC Sports, doing television features and essays. And it was just a way to try something a little different, as I'm sure a lot of you guys and a lot of you women have done in your careers, to just test something different, to flex some different muscles and use your creative energies in a different way. And it's been a lot of fun. And then about a year ago, NBC and I talked and about maybe expanding my role there. And at the time, things were not going in a great direction at SI. Not for me. Everything was great there. I had 25 years and 3 months, and I never had a bad day on the job, but the company was starting to struggle. And I saw some bad things coming, and I really wanted to leave SI with nothing but good memories. So last June, just about a year ago now, at the end of June, I separated from SI completely and went to NBC full time. And we'll ride that out for a little while longer and then see what it's like not to care who wins games on the weekend.
certainly an amazing career, one that says there's no straight line in a career path, but there are also some good people that, as you said, gave you breaks along the way. We all need those along the way. I'm sure you let them know how valuable that is. But congratulations on that. And I loved your last comment. You know, as we get older and mature, sometimes it's okay to change things up, test yourself in different ways. So very cool.
For sure. Yeah.
So, so what has it been like as a sports journalist now during such crazy times when you really cover, when there's no live sporting events that are taking place, basically?
Yeah, I think a couple things have happened, you know, from my perspective. The first one is just an extension of something that's happened in sports writing being my little corner of the world, but also in journalism as a whole, which is there has been, and I'll address this in terms of sports writing, there's been a gradual pulling away from the conventional runs, hits, errors, bats and balls, touchdowns and extra points way of covering the sport. And I'm not talking about the whole analytics end of it, which is another silo altogether, but more the conventional journalism and storytelling part of it. And I think what's happened over the last 5, 10, 15 years is that sports journalists have become more adventuresome and more creative in finding things to write about, finding stories to tell that may not be right in the middle lane of sports. And part of that is due to the public appetite changing. You can get plenty of live sports on TV, and it's hard for a writer to consistently and productively give you something better than what you just saw live. So you kind of have to get outside those boundaries a little bit and find stories about the people and stories about the people that made the people and stories about the teams and stories about trends and stories about history. I think all that was happening more and more in sports. I mean, it's a good example is the story that I wrote almost 10 years ago now on Mike Riley, which I know it was a very Williams story. Probably some of the people here are familiar with it, but he was a guy who played for Williams in the early 60s and died very young, and his number was retired almost by happenstance. And it just led down some amazing paths of storytelling. And that story was published by Sports Illustrated in 2011. And I think 5 years earlier, I would have been laughed out of the building if I even pitched it. But the landscape shifted, and that becomes relevant now because, you know, since March 16th or so, there haven't been any games. So all of us who cover sports in any way have had to tap into those skills to find out, okay, what stories can we tell that aren't about a game that was just played or a game that's about to be played? Because sports writing at a very fundamental level is you're either setting up a game or you're saying about what may happen, or you're telling people what did happen. But the storytelling part of it is very different and very much plays into a world in which there are no games. And so I think that everybody who's in this business has worked very hard to try and utilize those skills. And then on a parallel track to that, it's been a stunning period. Again, journalism writ large for sure, but sports writing as a microcosm of that for real news. And, I think that the way that individuals and leagues and teams and commissioners have responded to the coronavirus and what it's done to their public exposure and to their, even more so to their business model, has been a huge ongoing story. And then in the middle of all that, we had probably the most intense period of racial unrest in America. And since in 50 years, I think most people have agreed, but pick a number, it's been a long time, and it's very intense now, and it's ongoing intensely. And I think that's also, obviously, the story of race in America is also very, very much connected to sports, not in an important way, but in a very significant way. And so when you take the virus and the response to it, and then the racial story of America now and in perpetuity going backward, it's just been an incredibly rich and unusual time for tapping into those things. And I think that the larger world of journalism and also sports journalism has really delivered some amazing stuff. And obviously we're in a polarizing time too. So what I call amazing, somebody else might think is terrible. But at the same time, I think it's tested everybody in my field. And think a lot of people have done really tremendous work, and it's really, really given a rebirth to a lot of people and a lot of platforms.
Yeah, really, really great comments. Yeah, so as you look at professional sports and the platforms that they represent, you know, as you were saying, how do you think they have or will continue to change? Obviously, you wrote a great article recently about the NFL and Drew Brees. And actually, the following day, the NFL commissioner came out with their new stance. You know, the recent ESPY Awards event and the NASCAR racing have really brought, as you said, real changes to professional sports and commentary. So how do you see that today and again continue to change in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think, John, we got two things going on. You know, first of all, there's this overriding issue of when will sports be played again in a way that we recognize. You know, I mean, I was at the Belmont Stakes on Saturday, which was, depending on what your view of horse racing is, but even if you have no interest in horse racing, the Belmont Stakes is a huge part of, it's a milepost on the sports calendar. And that took place on Saturday, and I was there to cover it. And it was a remarkable experience. I think the New York Racing Association and Belmont did a tremendous job of keeping everybody safe. But it was a very strange day to witness what really is a major sports event with no spectators, where you could hear sounds, horses being whipped and horses breathing and jockeys talking to the horses as they're riding them. So I think that's the one story that's going forward, is when will sports look normal? And I think the answer is not anytime soon, but I don't have any inside information. And I don't even think Roger Goodell knows the answer to that question, or Adam Silver. But they're all trying to figure that out, or any Division I athletic directors. So that's the first part. And then the second part is what you were referencing is, you know, has the landscape shifted in terms of the racial construct of sports in America, which, you know, again, is the story of sports in America, because essentially you have a labor force that's majority Black or Latino or other minorities, but largely Black, and a viewership that's largely white, and a management that's largely white. And now there's a lot of pushback and a lot of reality that affects that. And maybe, hopefully, without, you know, the column you referenced that I wrote after Drew Brees' comments, I spent a lot of time talking to Dr. Harry Edwards, who's I'm sure many people are familiar with him, a tremendous authority in this area, whose battle in civil rights goes back 55 years. And I've gotten to know Harry really well over time and talked to him a lot. But essentially, the story that I tried to write was to say that maybe we're at a point where the viewing public can better understand who they're watching, and not just view the athletes, white or Black, but mainly Black, as cardboard cutouts for their amusement. And maybe they can better understand that a lot of Black athletes have a lot more in common with George Floyd than they realize. Not the athletes realize, than the spectators realize. And I think all that is just sort of bubbling to the surface now in an important way in sports. And we're going to see what happens with Colin Kaepernick this fall, and how the public responds to that. And these are all hugely important things that are going to happen in some way or another. The question is whether they happen in an environment that anybody can call normal, or if they happen in empty stadiums. And again, I don't think we know the answer.
Yeah. You recently wrote that sports might be permanently changed by all of this that's going on today. You know, how so? How do you see that changing?
Yeah, that was well, for everything I just said in one way, you know, I think that's one way that it'll happen. But I think the other way is in the way that we see sports take place. You know, I think we'll see less personal interaction between athletes and fans. The thing that triggered a column that I wrote in early May was watching The Last Dance, which was done by Jason Heyer, who's Williams 98. And it was a scene with Michael Jordan leaving the floor of United Center in Chicago after a playoff win. And he was holding his hands up and he was slapping five with all these fans. And I just thought, well, that's over. And I talked to a bunch of epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists, and everyone agrees that things like that, there's just going to be a greater distance between the athletes and the public, at least for a while. There's some people that think everything will go back to normal. We're all going to shake hands again. We're all going to hug each other again. We're all going to kiss each other on the cheek again. And I don't know about it. That falls into that huge category, which I was talking about, which is we just don't know. But I think in sports, I think that, you know, I had this long relationship with Usain Bolt, the great sprinter from Jamaica, who's a wonderful guy and one of my favorite people ever in sports. And I mean, man, when Usain wins a race, he goes around the arena and stops at about every third person and puts his arm around and takes a camera and takes a selfie. And, you know, he's probably not, there is no Bolt anymore, but there's somebody will replace him and that person won't do that. And I think that's going to be a loss. In my own world, I think that there's going to be a lot fewer personal interviews and a lot more interviews that are done like this. I think something will be lost in that too, but I think open locker rooms, which the public may not think are necessary, but they really are a big part of delivering great stories of athletes to the public. I think we're going to see the end of that. I don't know about things like high fives and handshakes on the court, or, you know, baseball players spitting, which is supposedly going to be outlawed. I don't really know where all that goes. I suspect we backslide to something closer to normal on that, but everything is on the table. But I think at the very bottom of the paragraph, I would say, I think what I wrote in that story was sports are going to be back, but they're going to look a little different.
Yeah. Kind of an extension of that, you know, how might all of this affect the business, you know, as a sports journalism and yourself and by extension, that journalism at large?
Yeah. I think most people know that mainstream journalism, especially at the regional and local level, is in trouble. That's been happening for a long time. You know, I think all of us our age in whatever business we've been in have seen earth-shaking changes over the course of our careers, largely driven by technology. We've lived in an amazing time when, you know, we graduated from college 15 to 20 years before there was an internet, 30 years before there were smartphones. So the changes have been stunning. And in journalism, those changes have really served to sort of bankrupt the conventional model of the local newspaper. So a lot of local newspapers are gone, and the pandemic has really accelerated all that, because it's very difficult to do any kind of business during the pandemic. Any kind of advertising-based business has really suffered. So, you know, journalism has been on its heels for a while. Certain big outlets have survived, like the New York Times with its digital subscriptions, the Washington Post with a very wealthy sugar daddy making that happen. And those are things that are necessary. Sports Illustrated has really struggled, you know, largely because we made all our money as a paper print publication, and then did not make a good pivot to digital media, and made several mistakes along the way. And SI is very much in trouble right now. So I just think that a business that was, the shortest way to say this is a business that was already in trouble, has seen its struggles accelerated by the pandemic. The business of sports has suffered, may wind up suffering even more. Obviously, the reason that the NBA is trying to play 8 regular season games and a very quick playoff is because they want to recoup some television rights money to mitigate their losses. The NFL wants to play in empty stadiums because that will enable them to be on television and collect television rights, and it will allow networks like the one I work for to not take a huge loss on not having the NFL on television. And the Division I sports model, very much dependent upon football being played in full stadiums. And that's why I think you'll see Alabama and LSU and Michigan and Penn State and everybody else, especially Alabama, LSU, and schools in the South where football really has a passion surrounding it that the rest of the country doesn't really understand, but it's real. They're gonna try to play football games in a stadium until it's impossible, and then I think they'll try some more. They just have to, because, you know, if Tennessee loses a season of football, they'll have to fire a lot of people and they'll have to cut a lot of sports. And it's not their fault. It's their fault that they built a model that was built sort of like a Jenga tower, sitting on top of football stadiums. But there's going to be changes in that way unless somehow everything goes smoothly in the next 6 months, which I think that scenario would be a surprise to everybody.
Yeah, certainly challenging times for all, and not having a crystal ball to figure out where it's going to go. So hopefully in Williamstown, we'll be able to get things back up there, even though it's a little bit smaller, a little different. So how little
Yeah.
did we know? Division III would be a little bit safer. But hey,
Mhm.
my last question, then we can open up for questions. We're right on time. I really appreciate it. But my last formal question for you, do you have one or a story or two, favorite or most intriguing persons or interviews that you've had or events that you've covered, and why?
Well, I'll always say that question comes up all the time. It was easier when I'd been working 5 years than it is when I've been working 42. But I'll say Mike Tyson is probably Mike Tyson, Michael Phelps, Usain Bolt, Peyton Manning, Drew Brees, Brady. Those guys are among the most memorable, sort of really well-known athletes that I've covered. And I have great stories about all those guys. You know, in 2015, being in a restaurant in Tempe, Arizona with Michael Phelps when he hadn't done a single interview since he basically dropped off the face of the earth, and, you know, over a giant omelet just looked at me and said, well, you know, I really wanted to kill myself a year ago. And from there, an amazing story. But really, when I try and narrow it down, you know, the two stories I remember best, you know, Mike Riley has a place of its own, and a story I did about my uncle, who's a baseball Hall of Famer, has a place of its own, and they're both very close to my heart. But in 1997, I met Pat Tillman, and everybody knows who Pat Tillman is now. He became very famous. I met him when he was a senior in college, and to this day, he remains, and I'm sure my memory of him is colored by the fact that he died young and by the things that he did. But at age 21, he was one of the most unusual, memorable guys that I ever came across. He couldn't lie. I asked him 3 or 4 questions that he could have easily evaded. I asked him, just as a cover my butt last question, I said, well, just so I don't look bad in public, have you ever been arrested or been to jail? And he looked at me and said, dude, yeah, I have. And it turns out he'd done time in a juvenile detention center for beating up somebody who beat up a friend of his, but the record was expunged. He didn't have to tell me, but he was just genetically unable to lie. And I stayed in touch with Pat after he got out of Arizona State, and stayed in touch with his family. And obviously what he did by going into the military and going to Afghanistan and getting killed by friendly fire was incredibly tragic and sad for me. And you know, I always show people, this is, after I wrote about Pat, that's the card that he sent me, okay? And he wrote a little note inside, and I can tell you that not many people do that. And, you know, the note says, thank you for the time you put into the article. My family and I really enjoyed the way it turned out. Perhaps our paths will cross again someday, and you and Kevin, that's his brother, and I can have another dinner. This time you pick the restaurant. Until then, take care and tell your kids I said hello. And I always liked that the picture is a lone wolf. The other really strong memory for me is 5 days after 9/11, I went to Staten Island and did a story on a guy named Joe Andruzzi. And Joe was an offensive guard for the Patriots at the time in 2001. And they won the Super Bowl that year. And Joe had 3 brothers who were New York City firemen. And at the time on 9/11, all 3 of them were in various towers. And his youngest brother, Jimmy, actually ran out of Tower 2 about 3 or 4 minutes before it came down. And Joe was in New England at football practice. So there was this incredible juxtaposition between this sort of sainted life as an NFL player and then these 3 guys who were firemen, and obviously what we all know as the most fireman-centric event in the history of the country. And I tried for 3 or 4 days to see if I could go see the family. And on Saturday, Joe's agent said, why don't you go to Staten Island tomorrow, and Joe will be there, and all three of his brothers and their parents will be there, and you can have dinner with them and talk to the family. And so I drove to Staten Island. I drove down the New Jersey Turnpike. You could see the rubble. You know, everyone who's driven the Jersey Turnpike, you're across from Lower Manhattan and go over the Verrazano Bridge onto Staten Island. And I got there ahead of everybody. And the only people there were our photographer and Joe's parents. And his mom was in the kitchen. So I just started talking to his mom because that's what I do. I talk to people. And she had the Staten Island Advance out on the kitchen table. And it was 5 or 6 broadsheet pages. And a broadsheet is, you know, it's 2 big facing pages like the New York Times, not like a tabloid. And all it was were headshots of Staten Island residents who had died that week. And she was pointing to the names on the page, and I knew him. He played Little League with Jimmy. He played football with Joey. And it was just, and then she started to cry. And then Joe came, and then all 3 brothers came, and they hugged in the living room. And Jimmy told the story of running out of the building. And it was just, you know, just such a overwhelming experience. And also as a journalist, to be trusted with their life story right in the middle of it. And, you know, I left their house and I drove back into Manhattan, and Manhattan at the time was deserted. And I went through the Holland Tunnel. You know, they stopped my car and looked in my trunk and went into the office and wrote that story, and then had to write it pretty fast because it was Sunday night deadline at SI, and got back in the car, and I was driving home, and I made it about halfway home, and on the Merritt Parkway just started crying. And I just, you know, not for long, for like 5 minutes, because I had to get it out. And I didn't lose anybody in 9/11, and I wasn't the one who ran out of the tower. But sometimes the reason I remember that story is because as a journalist, it just sticks with you. And I've stayed in touch with Joe over the years, and Joe beat cancer years later, and he's a very dedicated guy to a lot of causes now, and just a great family, and just amazing to be with them for a few hours on that day. So that's why I remember that.
Wow. Tim, that's a real testament to you, not only just an amazing writer, but also those 2 stories were really about, you know, about humanity, you know, and really trusting and working with people and touching their families' lives. So those are great stories. Well, thank you for that. And again, what I'm going to do now is we'll open it up for Q&A. I know our classmates will not be shy or won't be crickets. But let me tell you how it'll work. Last time we opened it up, there was some background noise. We'll just try it this way. If not, we'll open it up. But if you have questions that you want to ask Tim, just go to the bottom of your Zoom bar. There is something where it says participants. So if you see that, just click on participants. And then on the right-hand side in that panel, it allows you to raise your hand. That means you've got a question, and Kate from the college and I can let you in if you have a question to ask. So just go down to that participant, just click on the participants, just raise your hand, and then we'll open up the mic and give you a free rein to see if you have a question or 2 for Tim, or any other comments or feedback on his stories tonight. So don't be shy. Kate, do you see anybody, any hands go up? Okay, well, why don't we just, hey, Kate, can you open up all the lines? Just unmute everybody? Oh, I'll just unmute all. Okay. So I'm going to unmute all. So now everybody's live. Don't have to worry about Zoom, but would love to get any other comments or feedback from the group, or questions that Tim can address. There's Kevin. I see Kevin.
I have a question.
Oh.
It's Miranda.
Okay, you beat Kevin to it. Go for it, Miranda.
Oh, sorry, Kevin. I'm just curious about, were you surprised with the vehemence of the Black Lives Matter past couple of weeks, given how much interaction you've had in the sports world?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, Miranda? Once it was surprised at what developments?
Just at how big it was the last couple of weeks of protests.
Do
you see any journal?
Yeah, I want to be careful, because obviously those protests weren't specifically about sports, but like I said early on, the whole sports is just tremendously intimately connected to race in America. So in that regard, no, not surprised. And I think that in a lot of ways, I just think that, I think those protests are going to, we're going to see the effects of those protests in sports down the road from here, a month or 2 months or 3 months or 6 months. And I just think we're going to see a new level of activism and effect by athletes. And I think it's going to be tremendously exciting to see how that all plays out.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think Drew Brees was a good example of that because, I've covered Drew since he was a sophomore in college, and I do think highly of him. I don't agree with all his stances. And I think he was completely thrown off his game by the reaction to his one comment that he would never support anyone who didn't stand for the anthem or in any way did what Drew called disrespecting the flag, which is not what Kaepernick is trying to do, or anyone that's doing that. And I think Brees was overwhelmed by the response, and that's why he backtracked. Now, he also backtracked to protect his brand, but at the same time, I think he learned from it. And I think it was a significant moment, and I think there'll be a lot more moments like that.
Great, thank you.
Or Kevin O'Rourke, I think you've got your hand up. You're on?
Oh, I just wanted to, Edith told me not to be the first, which is, I'm really glad that Miranda stepped in. I just wanted to first of all say, wouldn't it be great if that there were more people who were in leadership who were incapable of lying? I just want to say that off the top. But also, Roger Goodell, Tim, can you talk a little bit about his comments and about how Roger Goodell stepped up and said that the NFL was wrong in what it did, but never mentioned Colin Kaepernick? Do you think that's going to come back to bite him? And do you think that that the NFL will actually begin to address what they did to Kaepernick and the white ownership that permeates the NFL and how that's structured?
I think, Kevin, I think, first of all, I think everyone has to remember who Roger Goodell works for. He works for, he works for the owners. And the owners are, as you said, by and large, a white, wealthy male cohort. And he works for them. They pay him a very handsome salary. I think that Goodell for sure, I don't know how many of the owners, some of them, but Goodell for sure is trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing right now. And I think he's come to understand that it's not blowing in the same direction as 2016 and 17, but I don't think he's figured out yet how strongly it's blowing. And I think that sort of issuing a generic apology, but stopping short of naming Kaepernick was sort of his way of sort of a half measure. And then I think that he and all the owners are going to be faced with having to address this same situation either in August or September or October, whenever games are played again. And I think that I'm not sure any of them are ready for what may happen. I think it may be out of their hands in a way that they didn't anticipate. Now, I think that's going to be one of the most fascinating stories to watch for the rest of the year and maybe in our lifetime. Tommy Smith is a good friend of mine, and obviously Tommy and John Carlos are the owners of the most significant protest in sports history, and they suffered their lives for that, and they only became iconic when they were in their 60s. And I hope Kaepernick can be forgiven before that, but I don't think any of us really know how it's going to play out or how Goodell and the ownership is going to respond, and whether they're going to be looking to Washington, D.C. to learn how to respond. And the winds may be blowing in a different way there too. So it's a very complicated ecosystem.
Great. Kevin, thanks for that. And Edith, thanks for giving, Kevin the buy on this question. So actually, Kate Stone Lombardi has a question. Kate, you're live.
Oh, okay. Hey, Tim, thank you. That was just a great presentation. Really appreciated it. So my question has to do with football, although not with COVID and actually not with everything going on with racial equity right now. But I'm kind of view myself as a recovering football fan. I used to really like football, but between the head injury stuff that was coming out pre-COVID, the sexism that's just so rampant, I had a lot of trouble. I just couldn't support it anymore. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the future of football, irrespective of everything else that's going on, but looking at the medical stuff as well as, some of the other controversies that are going on.
Yeah, I think that anybody who's covered a lot of football over their career has, unless they have no conscience, they've experienced some kind of a ethical or moral crisis in the last decade or so. I think 2010, October 16th or something like that, 2010 is what everyone called Bloody Sunday, or Black Sunday. When there were so many of those terrible head hits and head shots in the NFL on one Sunday, James Harrison on Mohamed Massaquoi and Brandon Merriweather on Todd Heap, and there were a few others. And obviously in the years since then, there's been so much learned about head injuries and CTE, and it's really, there's no way to cover the sport and not think about that stuff. I've done at least 3 major features on athletes who have had multiple concussions in their career, and those get to be really, 3 or 4 years ago, I did a piece on London Fletcher, who was a long-time NFL linebacker, and he was playing for the Redskins at the time. And we drove all around Washington and suburban Washington for like 4 hours one afternoon, and I wound up asking him, how many concussions have you had in your career? And he was like, man, I can't even begin to count, the number of plays I played that I don't remember. And, and that's just one small example. And he's worried about whether he's going to forget his car keys when he's 45 years old. And I don't know again, this is another, I guess, and I'm trying to find an escape from this, but I don't know where all that ends. I think football has already proven more resilient than we thought it might be when this first started to surface. Television ratings have come back up. In stadium viewership has come back up, not in college so much, but in the NFL. The NFL has proved pretty indestructible. And if it's going to suffer, I don't think it's going to suffer in a big way until we see the declining numbers in youth football now sort of extrapolated over time, and the labor force is diminished. But as someone covering it, it's harder to cover now than it was.
Hey, thanks, Tim. If everybody could just or put themselves on mute, Tim, don't put yourself on mute. But we are getting a little background. That would be great. Actually, the next question is from Steve Meyer. Good to see you, my friend. I haven't seen you since reunion in New Canaan. So,
hey, John.
How are you, man?
Hey, Tim.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, I'm wondering what you're thinking, what you know about Division III sports and NESCAC. I note that I don't know what Williams' plan is to reopen this fall, but I note that I'm up here in Middlebury. Middlebury has quite a different plan than Bowdoin does. So there are like multiple different NESCAC schools that have different plans about reopening their campuses, how many students they're inviting back, how it's all going to play out. And I just can't see very much sports happening at all this fall, but I'm wondering what you're thinking, and maybe you've got your finger on some information either about Williams or other D3 schools.
I had a conversation, Steve, this week with somebody who's involved in the Ivy League at a high level, and that person said that they would be shocked if the Ivy League played fall sports this year in any conventional way. Steve's reference earlier was Bowdoin issued a statement where they said they won't have any sports until January 1st, which those of you that remember the sports calendar, that means the entire fall season and a pretty big chunk of the winter season. Basketball and hockey will have played probably 40% of their schedule by January 1st. That was a huge step by Bowdoin, and obviously it's been met with some outrage by parents and others in the athletic community. Tufts has come out and said that they're going to try and play sports in as normal a fashion as possible. You get into an issue where you got to have somebody to play. My sister-in-law is a dean at Claremont McKenna, which I'm sure some people on here know, which is a NESCAC-like college in Southern California. And they're trying to play sports. Their conference is a lot more compact than NESCAC. It's basically every college is within 30 miles. That may make it more doable. A high percentage of their population from Southern California or within a few hours drive, although they do have a national thing too. The college sports model is just kind of as you guys could figure this out, it's a kind of a side version of the entire college conundrum here, of trying to get 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 or 50,000 people from all over the place back on a campus and not create tremendous spread of the virus. And I think what I've been told is that the colleges that are trying to distance themselves from sports, which is mostly Division III or really low-level Division I, have just decided that they've got enough on their plate without worrying about sports. It's another whole problem. Let's take that out of the mix. Then we don't have to worry about football players spitting on each other on the line of scrimmage or all those kind of things. And, it's just, I did talk to an epidemiologist early on, and I said, well, how do you protect football players? Those guys spit on each other. And she was appalled. She said, people spit on each other? Yes, they do spit on each other. So I don't know where Division III lands on this, but my sense is that where sports falls into it is right now it's an inconvenience in light of the larger picture, which is hugely troublesome as it is. And trying to fit sports into that model is just a big problem right now. And when you talk about Texas and Alabama, it's not just an inconvenience, it's part of an economic engine that they really have to feed. As I referenced earlier, with Mississippi or Alabama or Texas or Arizona State, without football and a full stadium for 7 home games is a real problem for keeping their athletic departments afloat. So their problem is entirely different. But I think depending on where this goes in the next month or two, I think you're going to see a lot of Division III commit to some kind of alternate sports model.
Interesting times for sure. Mario Chiappetti, you're out there. You're live. Mario, oh, there you go.
I am. Yep. Okay. Hi, Tim. John, great job managing the conversation. Tim, I know you're close to the Olympics, and I've been following the Olympics and all the problems they're having in certain classes like swimming and gymnastics. And so, do you think that the U.S. Olympic Committee has done enough to prevent similar problems? Have they changed the way these different sports are addressing these issues that came to the newspapers? So what do you think?
So you're talking about the sort of the gymnastics and swimming, sexual abuse scandals, those things?
Yes.
No. I mean, they have so much work still to do. The gymnastics model is still a mess. The swimming model is still a mess. There's a lot. I have a couple of friends at SI that were working on swimming stories that involve some very prominent people that never came to fruition, but they certainly had the ring of truth to them. When things first started to surface with the gymnastics and with Alberto Salazar and Mary Kane, I reached out to a few track athletes, some women that I've known over the years, and said, hey, does track and field have a big problem with predatory coaches and dependent female athletes who are making very little income and really need these coaches on their side. And the responses I got from these women were, yes, but we're not going on the record right now because you're talking about breaking up marriages and ruining lives. And it's an incredibly volatile and dangerous landscape. And I just think there's the entire culture of empowered male culture, empowered male coaches and female athletes who really need those coaches and need to be well respected in the system. It's just super toxic. And I just, it's a long way from being resolved. And now we're in a period where there's no Olympic Games this year, so funding is terrible. So athletes that are not at the upper end of the spectrum are not getting much money at all. So the desperation level gets cranked up even higher. And I don't think anybody is convinced that this is going to be an Olympics next summer either. And then Beijing in 2022 is certainly not a lock. So I just think the answer is really just no. There's just so many more problems in that area that have to be addressed and are not even close to being. The system is still in place and just needs a complete overhaul, but it's hard to overhaul the system and still promise gold medals. And gold medals are what make everything run.
Thanks, Mario. Great question. Tim, good response. Never easy out there. Pam Jennings, you have your hand up. You're live.
Great, thanks. Hi, Tim. I really
Hey, Pam.
enjoyed your presentation. It's wonderful. I was particularly interested in your comment about basically the relationship between white viewers and Black athletes, especially since there's such a high percentage of Black athletes. And it got me thinking about what kind of developments there may have been over the years in white audiences when it comes to Black athletes. Like I was thinking back to Jesse Owens, to Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, and then, on to Colin Kaepernick, and just kind of wondering if you have any thoughts about how the white psyche may have evolved over the years in terms of how they're perceiving Black athletes.
Yeah, I think, Pam, Jesse Owens is a great example. And he's a guy who he's treated in history as an American hero. But the reality is that when he came home from Berlin, he never really had a good job the rest of his life. He was welcomed back as a novelty, rather than as a valued member of society. And, I think Muhammad Ali has an entirely different place in history. But I think history would also remember that there were many, many people in America who did not like Muhammad Ali because Muhammad stood up for things that made people uncomfortable, as did Tommy Smith and John Carlos. And Tommy and John, who I know both of those men they really struggled in life after they came back from Mexico City after making a statement that people use the picture of those two men as in many ways that are unfair to them. But I think what's happened, I respect, some colleagues of mine who are men of color, like Howard Bryant and Mike Freeman and Jim Trotter, a lot of guys who understand this better than I do because of the color of their skin. I think what's happened over time is we see people like Bill Russell, Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown. Jim Brown is another man I've spent a lot of time with, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and we see them as evidence of progress. And then we get to Colin Kaepernick, and then we get to what we've seen in this country in the last couple months, and we realize that what looks like progress might be sort of just occasional blips that really, in a lot of ways, and I'll say this, when I wrote a few weeks ago that it would do the culture of sports and sports fans, that it would do us a lot of good if white fans understood that the Black player who they view as a billionaire is actually probably a guy who came from, not everybody. We're a very broad culture, but there are a lot of Black players in all sports who came from very difficult circumstances. My friend Mike Rosenberg once wrote that an NBA locker room is one of the very few places in America you can go and find a young man who is in the 1%, 1/10 of 1% of earners in America, and 5 years earlier was looking for his next meal. And I think that fans, white fans in particular, don't like to think of it that way. And when I wrote those words, I got a lot of comments from people saying, hey, Tim, boo-hoo. I'm not going to feel sorry for these millionaires. Just play ball. And by the way, Tim, stick to sports. And, you know, so I just think that there's not an uncomfortable, as an inappropriate relationship that exists there. And I think the Black athlete in America has always understood that, but hopefully feels more empowered now to do something about it. And I'm just really excited to see how the fall goes, if there's football. And I want to see somebody sign Kaepernick. I wish it would be the Patriots, because if anybody can do this, it's Belichick, and withstand the blowback. But I don't know if he'll do it because of his owner. But I want to see the response if Colin Kaepernick gets signed and kneels down and everybody kneels with him, because the strength is in the numbers. But I fear that continuum of history, there hasn't been that much improvement in pick a number of years.
Pam, great question. Tim, great, response, and thank you for writing and supporting all the challenges that are going on both on and off the field, and the impact that can have, really kind of make a big difference as we're seeing this going on. We have a question from Chuck Sanders. Chuck, good to have you on again tonight.
Hey, hope everyone's doing well and safe. Tim, I'm going to give you a past and future question.
Yeah.
Looking at back of your career, what is the story that you did not write that you look back and reflect and say, I should have written that story? And what's the story that you would like to write in the future? Even if it's a story about Lindsay Lamb under the circumstances.
There's obviously, Chuck, there's so many stories I wish I had written, but I guess one that I wish I had written sooner than I was ready to write it. In 1997, a woman named Marion Jones broke onto the scene in track and field in America. Marion was a well-known quantity by then. She had almost made the Olympic team in 1992 as a high school runner. She was on the University of North Carolina national championship basketball team as a freshman, so unbelievable athlete. In 1997, she came back to track and field, started running fast. In 1998, she started running really, really, really fast and competed in something like 40 races in 1998, didn't get beat once, just piled great performance on top of great performance. And it felt like she was also engaged to and would eventually marry a shot putter at the time, and had an agent who was not known to be trustworthy inside the sport. And I was friends with Marion, and I was friends with CJ, her husband, and with Charlie, her agent. And she was good copy, and she was a big star. And I didn't push hard enough to figure out if she was using steroids or not. And in my heart of hearts, I knew she was. And I knew a lot of people were, but she was the biggest name. And I just didn't go there. And I wish I had. And eventually we found out that she was using steroids. And I don't, to this day, I don't have a relationship with Marion because she didn't appreciate some of the things I wrote as all that happened. But I really liked her, and I think she was connected herself with some lousy people. And she would have been a great athlete without drugs. And I can't say that about everybody. I felt the same way about Lance Armstrong, but everybody wishes they wrote that story because everybody knew, but everybody was afraid of Lance, and he was an American hero. But Marion was someone I knew personally and I knew well, and all the signs were there, and I didn't write that. And I don't know, the story that I'd like to write, I guess if I had a good answer, I would have written it already. But the best answer I can give is the story that I just described to Pam, which is that I'd love to be in the stadium when Kaepernick kneels again and everybody kneels with him, or Kaepernick kneels and everybody in the stadium stands up and cheers. I'd like to see that. And there's a lot of other little ones. I'd love to see Mary Kane, the woman I described. I'd love to see her run a mile again and run really fast after everything she went through. You know, I'd love to see Usain Bolt run again, but it's not going to happen because he's too old and beat up, you know, but that's a tough one because as a journalist, the story sometimes isn't there till it's there.
Great question. Tim, that's a good one. I do hope you get to write that story on Kaepernick and everything else. So we're all rooting to see good things happen out of this. I don't see any more hands up, but any other questions for Tim?
Yeah, hey, this is Jim Stewart. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hey, hey, Tim, fellow Schenectadian here.
Hey,
How you
Stewie.
doing?
Yeah, how are you? Good
All
to
right,
see you,
man. Yeah, you too. Love the presentation. Enjoyed it. I want to ask you about one of your favorite people, Mike Tyson. You've been in the news recently, making a comeback, perhaps. I don't know if you had any inside scoop there, but also just how far boxing has fallen, really, in relation to MMA. They've certainly outmarketed them like crazy, and what your thoughts are on what boxing might need to do to kind of come back in the limelight.
Yeah, Jim, I'll take Tyson first. You know, as far as the comeback goes, obviously don't do it. You know, it's like, it's a very bad idea. If you think Mike Tyson should come back, just go to YouTube and queue up the Lennox Lewis fight from 17 years ago and watch what happened to Mike that night. And I know I think, you know, Mike was I met Mike when he was 18 years old and living in Catskill, obviously Capital District. And I got to know him really well. I spent a lot of amazing time with him, you know, some incredible stories. One of my favorite Mike Tyson stories was when he was married to Robin Givens. I went to Atlantic City to write a story about Mike, and Mike was a stubborn, proud young guy, and we were in his locker room, and it was me and Robin Givens and Mike and Kevin Rooney, who was his trainer, and Mike finished his workout, stripped off all his clothes, walked into the shower, turned on the shower. 30 seconds later, the shower turned off. Mike walks out, and Robin Givens looks at him and says, "Michael Tyson, that shower was too short." And Mike Tyson turned around and walked back into the shower, and the water ran for about 5 minutes. Sorry, I just wanted to share that one. I reconnected with Mike about 4 years ago and did a story for SI about his early days. And we had a great time talking because Mike was kind of coming up as I was coming up. And I was a lot, you know, I'm 10 years older than him, but we had a great time together. He really was an amazing talent, and he put his body through some terrible stuff once he got rich and famous. And also had got some very bad people got their hooks in the Mike. And I'm just happy for Mike that he may or may not have done some bad things. I don't know the answer to that question. But I know he did some bad things. The bad thing that he went to prison for, I don't know. But I find him to be an appealing character, and he and I are friends, and he's lost a child, and he's had a lot of bad things, and he's somehow alive. And I don't know how that's happened, but I'm happy for him, and I hope he goes nowhere near a boxing ring unless they can somehow find somebody really, really terrible for him to fight, that he can beat up and maybe collect a small paycheck that he doesn't really need. Boxing got splintered among too many alphabet organizations in the 80s and 90s, and they lost the ability to have a champion. And they had a couple deaths in the ring that were not good, and it's a dangerous sport, and a lot of people don't like it on general principle, and I can see why. And they did get outflanked by MMA, and I don't know that boxing is ever coming back to what it was. I don't think Mike is bringing him back, for sure.
Wow. Stewie, great question. Good to see you again. It's been a while. So we have Tim Connolly raised his hand. Tim, you are live.
Hi, thank you very much, and thanks for having an 81er in your midst here. I appreciate it. Hey, Timmy, good to see you.
Hey,
was wondering your thoughts on the future of baseball. You know, we're all dealing with the pandemic, and I think most people are struck with either tone deaf or arrogant or selfish that what's going on in that sport with declining demographics. And oftentimes TV and your parent company included bail out these sports and valuations as the TV contracts go higher. Do you see the future of baseball changing? Do you see how the networks value baseball changing in the future?
I don't. I think we've all seen with TV, with baseball, is that it is first and foremost, it's most of its revenue comes from local and regional TV markets, right? It doesn't really have a lucrative. The postseason is fairly lucrative, but you know, baseball, I think people have come to understand, the aesthetics of the sport aside, I think most people have come to understand that it's bears more resemblance to college football than to the NFL, which is the NFL is very much a national sport, as is the NBA, different kind of demographic, different kind of fan base. But both of those, you can have you can have a Miami Heat fan in Michigan. You can have a Lakers fans all over the place. And I know that's kind of true with the Red Sox and Yankees and Dodgers, but by and large, you know, the St. Louis Cardinals or the Kansas City Royals have their fan base at home. Just like Texas, University of Texas is a Texas team. And I think the Milwaukee Brewers are a Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Northern Illinois, that's their fan base. And I think that's been their model. And they also need an in-stadium audience more than the NBA or the NFL. But the aesthetics of the game have suffered tremendously. First of all, it was too slow. The games are too long. And then the changes in the training and the conduct of the game over the last 5 or 6 years have resulted in a game that's basically strikes, walkouts, and home runs, or strikeouts, walks, and home runs. And pitchers that throw 103, 104, 105 miles an hour, batters that are taught to have an uppercut swing and look for a ball to hit out of the park, or walk. And I think that aesthetic has made the game boring, except for the hardcore fans who are our age. And that's not a recipe for future success. And I totally agree with you that the things that have gone on in the last month have not endeared them to what might be their new fan base. So, I mean, I don't see a great path forward for baseball right now unless the game has to change some way. And I don't know if that's rules changes. I don't see how putting the DH in the National League is going to change that much. I mean, it's going to make for more home runs and more strikeouts and more walks. I don't have a great feeling for baseball's future.
I hope that's not true. My son-in-law works for the Yankees, so I hope he has a good future. So, and he's responsible for revenue and putting the butts in his seat. So, any last questions for Tim before we call it a night? All right. Well, listen, I really appreciate everybody being on tonight. I know there's a lot going on around the world, but I love being here and seeing all your faces. My favorite is seeing when they're couples sitting together on a couch. That was some.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
John, let me just say one more thing to everybody. I just briefly mentioned the Mike Riley story that I did a few years ago. And I just wanted to say thanks to anybody out there that has reached out to me in any way over the years and thanked me for doing that piece, because the whole piece is owed to Dick Quinn, who's the sports information director at Williams, does an incredible job of publicizing the college, and to a guy named Ben Wagner from the class of '64, who was Mike Riley's co-captain in football. And, of all the stories I've done over the years, that was a really amazing thing to connect with guys from Williams who were in the class of '64 and to learn about what Williams was like back then, and which was really different from when we arrived there, which was only 9, 10, 11 years later. And it really, that story always has an incredibly warm place in my heart because of the connections I made and, talking to people who worked at Williams like Murph in the equipment room and things like that. So thanks to everybody who enjoyed that story, because it was really, I did a talk to the class of '64 once to a group of their people and said that, over the years, something I figured out was that I would never give a library to Williams, but the Mike Riley story is my library. So that was important to me. And I'm looking at a picture of that story right over my desk right now.
Well, Tim, thanks. You've touched our group tonight, our class, our college, but really the whole community and at large. the stories that you're writing about today, in the past, are really making a difference around the world. So thank you for that, the work that you do and the passion that you have, whether it's helping others and working with families and going into prisons and, helping incarcerated men, really try to get a footing on the ground. So you're a good human being, and we really appreciate you being on. There'll be a survey coming out from the college to everybody that signed up tonight. So please feel free to give any feedback on tonight's program. We are also looking, we will continue these again in the fall and winter. So any topics that you're looking for, we'd love to make sure that we're touching topics of interest for the class. Don't forget July 16th at 8 o'clock, we have John Winkleman, our famous sleep doctor, who will be on stage then. For those that were at a reunion, I guess the previous reunion, it was a packed house, and he really had some interesting topics. So I promise you won't fall asleep during his comments. I also want to thank Kate Stone-Lombardi. Kate has worked with me to kind of put these programs together from inception. So Kate, we couldn't do it without you. And remember, she is our class secretary. So keep all the communications coming into Kate. And I think she's waiting for more before we finish this month's deadline. I also want to thank our 78 class officers, Pam Jennings, Julie Dunn, Walter Ogier and Kevin O'Rourke. They've been very supportive of this program and all the activities that we're doing as a class. It's never dull, but there's enough going on. All the class agents, Kate Ryan, who's helping us from the college tonight. Kate, thank you for joining from Williamstown area, and all the great work that you're doing tonight to make sure this goes. So thank you all in the Williams community for the past, present, and future. And we'll sign off and say, be safe, be well, and hopefully see you next month.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.